Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. It is Friday, December 13th. On December 1st, Vanessa Beeley and I had a conversation about what was going on in Syria. It's been an ongoing emotional roller coaster.
Of these groups were incubated anyway. They were radicalized by the United States in the CIA black sites. And that's the whole point, because the US is weaponizing terrorism. Since the war on terror, terrorism globally has grown exponentially. Clearly not a war on terror, it's a war of terror against anyone that stands in the way of the US allied agenda in whichever region that they're focused on. Because of course these same terrorist factions are reappearing and are being rebranded in Africa, in Yemen, in Libya. I mean, they're just being percolated around the globe wherever the US needs them. And when I'm talking about the US, I'm talking about the entire kind of alliance of US hegemony.
Welcome to The Last American Vagabond. It is Friday, December 13th. On December 1st, Vanessa Beeley and I had a conversation about what was going on in Syria. It's been an ongoing emotional roller coaster, if you will, to use a terrible analogy. We were discussing this before we started. And the unbelievable reality that we're in around not just Syria, but the genocide taking place in Gaza, the genocide that has evolved into Lebanon and now appears to be shifting into Syria just as well. So I want to start with the discussion her and I had around this on the first, and how much has shifted around this, and kind of follow up around all the different changes that we saw, the conversations we had around potential deals. But I wanted to start with her in particular around the social media aspect of this. And this is something that I'm really, more in the last so many 6 months than ever, but have been talking about a long time, how important it is that we highlight not just the independent media, mainstream alternative media, but just misinformation, people that are out there in deliberately trying to lead you in very particular partisan directions to manipulate for much larger agendas, and start how this has played out to begin with, and how much this has had an effect on people's lives on the ground in Syria, the average people that tend to take the brunt of all of these government agendas. So I invited Vanessa back on to discuss this and what we've seen so far, and what we will see going forward. So Vanessa, thank you for joining me yet again. How are you?
Yeah, I'm okay. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's a one of those kind of, it's just one of those times where, and again, I'm just kind of expressing that we were having a somber conversation before we got started, that I'm personally expressing how frustrating it is that we can be in this position where there's so much awareness around this topic, around, and again, just Gaza in particular, but now even in the same conversation around Syria, what Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is, what the relationship around the United States and Israel and their funding of these proxy elements that are now in charge of Syria, and asking the question of what will ultimately stop this. What is the line where people, the awareness around this suddenly cascades into actual action? And I think we're recognizing that that's just not how this really works. So let's start with the social media part of this, because I think you agree that I hesitate using the word misinformation, because I know there's a war against, people calling us misinformation, but there is false information out there. There's falsehoods, there's truth, and how much of an aspect that plays in not just the propaganda war, but the real people's lives on the ground that suffer because of that. So let's start there, and what you saw, and how that's still affecting what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the effect of social media, as you said. That was early December, and how social media was affecting the people on the ground of whatever the main topic is, right? Whether it's in China, Russia, Syria, Gaza, whatever, or Lebanon. But I think in Syria, it has played a particularly insidious role, because right from the beginning of the attack on Aleppo city in the north, social media was really whipping up terror and fear, and the sense of everything collapsing almost immediately. And that demoralization campaign in my opinion, was deliberate from influencers, people that have kind of meteorically risen to fame on social media. We have to remember that, you know, every area where we become successful, in other words, we become successful in disseminating information which is enabling people to understand the intricacy of the world that they live in, and at least get some insight into what their governments are kind of fabricating across the world in order to achieve whatever their agendas may be. As soon as that becomes successful, then it's infiltrated, and the more successful it is, the more infiltrated it is. And for me, it was never clearer than it has been over the last couple of weeks in Syria, where social media has literally been weaponized against the Syrian people in order to create this sense of loss, this sense of fear and apprehension, anxiety, panic. It was remorseless. And I think, you know, even if people are unwittingly doing this, okay, let's say there are some people who are unwittingly getting carried away with the wave of information that they think is correct or they think is factual. And perhaps they even feel, oh my God, you know, this is happening. I need to tell everyone because it's so awful and so on. But if we're not checking that information, then we're responsible for increasing the panic and the terror that the people in that country that is currently being targeted. And of course, we know, you know, it's going to move on to Iraq and so on and so forth. So we're going to be back in the same situation. And if we don't learn how to manage it from our own perspective, then that's not fair on the people that are facing the next wave of violence and proxy war and intervention and whatever else they've got up their sleeves to persecute people that have become for them irrelevant and dispensable.
Yeah, I definitely think that the weaponization of social media is a very, very important conversation to have in all of this. Now, I want to state, as I'm sure you would agree, that nobody here is calling for anyone to be censored. The point is that everyone out there has a right to be wrong, to lie. That's under free speech. But what we're talking about is the responsibility of it, right? That you out there sharing something. I mean, obviously there are people out there that do so for the very purpose of lying to people, and that is their right. But most people, what we're highlighting is will, you know, get caught up in all of it. And that's how this works. And thinking you're doing the right thing. And what she's pointing out is that it's your responsibility to make sure that you're checking for yourself and not just playing into the whole Twitter files play of it all, where you're just kind of getting caught up in the momentum of what they're pointing to and so on. And so this brings up a really interesting point to start with, which is that we've seen this played for a long time from both sides of this, where for a while you had the State Department and the U.S. government arguing that that was being done over there, which we can now clearly see they were responsible for, but saying, you know, Facebook was used to create this regime change or this, you know, revolution in foreign countries, right? They were really using that. Then it got flipped over to where it became, oh, we have to start censoring it here because it's being done to you. Now, whether that was actually the case, and they're the ones that kicked that can down the road or not, it's interesting to see how their own actions can be used against you. And so, you know, in this context of it all, we can see that it's happening both ways, that it is very clearly being used to manipulate people in Syria. And even and you can touch on this, that the honest people in Syria who then get convinced that they're fighting for the right thing because of State Department manipulation on these social media platforms, but at the same time saying through Elon Musk and everything else that they need to restrict certain things because you're at risk because of ISIS. Or as Trump said in 2015, I think we need to work with Gates to shut down the internet because ISIS is influencing you, you know? So I just think that's an interesting overlap to it all. And I think it's all by design. So you need your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's by design. And, you know, during the pandemic, we had 77th Brigade released to run and push certain narratives, to induce fear, to induce anxiety again about the whole situation, about the vaccine, and about the virus itself. You know, this kind of behavioral insights, of course, I think Britain's probably got to be number one in the engineering of mind manipulation. But of course, the US has also studied it for years, you know. And so I think the further we go down the path of wherever we are heading, and as you said before we came on, the future isn't looking that bright, to be honest. You know, the fall of Syria is a major blow internationally, as far as I'm concerned. It's not only for the resistance axis in Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, and so on, but I think globally, it's because what has it done? It's shown how powerful the machine is, right? How the machine can basically just consume whatever stands in its way if it really wants to, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
this was so fast. I mean, I can't remember. I think we were talking about the fact that once the ceasefire came into place between Lebanon and Israel, it was obvious that the only reason Netanyahu had accepted the ceasefire was because, yeah, okay, that's fine. That bit's done. Now we need to pivot to Syria. And nobody expected what happened to happen. I think all of us were bracing for Israeli bombing or for some kind of Israeli escalation towards Syria. And it was known for months in advance that there was going to be an attack from the northwest, but nobody
Mhm.
expected it to be on this scale.
Right.
You know,
I think Kevork Amazian pretty clearly predicted it. Like a lot of people did. They saw this coming because it
yeah, I
seemed pretty
mean, a
obvious.
lot of us did, to be
Hmm.
fair. I mean, it
Hmm.
was obvious, to be honest, and many of us had been talking about the precariousness of Syria's position for months, if not years,
Hmm.
because of the occupation by hostile states by proxy in the north, in the northwest, in the southeast, in the northeast. You know, at any point, all of these factions could be triggered, and that's basically what happened. But I don't think, I'm not quite sure why, from some perspectives, I don't think people realize the extent to which those contained elements had grown in strength and had been professionally trained, had been, you know, their weapon capability had been increased considerably, most recently by Ukraine in northwest Syria. And so the scale of the attack was perhaps far greater than was expected. But I
Hmm.
mean, we'll come on to that because there are other elements also involved, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. I want to touch on the idea of, the different elements of why that might have happened so quickly or why forces were pulled back in regard to the deal and possible conversations there. Before we get to that, though, you mentioned a few things I want to touch on. First, just the global repercussions. In a general broad sense, can you just touch on a few examples of, like, what in your mind are the global repercussions of this shift in control and power from Syria from Assad to whatever is happening now?
Well, I think, first of all, one of the main agendas, particularly for Israel, was to destroy the central link in the chain, in the resistance chain. So the major part of the land bridge coming from Iran through Iraq, Syria, into Lebanon and into Palestine, to also destroy Syrian capability of, one, defending itself, and two, producing the weapons that were being used by Hezbollah. So destroy the supply lines, prevent any resupply to Hezbollah, and destroy the capability of Syria to manufacture weapons that were then going to be supplied to the resistance factions. And at the same time, of course, what we've seen is Israel destroying pretty much 80% of Syria's military capability, whether defensive or offensive. So air defense, air bases, naval bases, oil tankers, all their essential infrastructure to be a military force to be reckoned with. And of course, who does that benefit? Benefits Israel. And
Right.
if you look at then the land grab, so you have Turkey in the north via its Free Syrian Army, Muslim Brotherhood, now known as the Syrian National Army, have taken the northern sectors and are now battling the Kurds for control in the northeast. HTS, which is backed by Israel, the US, the whole kind of regime change alliance, have taken sort of from the north down to Damascus, so that whole central area, and have included the areas of Latakia and Tartus on the coast, which were traditionally, of course, with the government, but also Alawite and other minority sects. And then Israel, of course, since HTS reached Damascus, have invaded the south of Syria and are now within, I think it's 20 to 26 kilometers of the center of Damascus on the western side. But they have control over Sueda and Dara and Quneitra in the south. And I think the potential there is to continue that belt around the southeastern and northeastern borders of Syria, or at least to have them under surveillance and under control of terrorist proxy forces, because of course ISIS has been for years incubated at Al Tanif, the US military base, at Rukban, so-called refugee camp to the south of Al Tanif, and then up controlling the main eastern border, which is the entry for the land bridge from Iran and Iraq. So in other words, when we look at what they've done in Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, then that will continue, in my opinion, into Iraq. And certainly the Iraqi resistance factions are preparing for this. And the Iranian advisor, I think, to the IRGC was talking about 11,000 ISIS already in Iraq, preparing to begin the attack in Iraq against the resistance factions there.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to get into the groups and the background and so on. And just I'll highlight what Patrick Hennington was saying, which I'm sure we're covering. This is exactly what is anyone I think has been paying attention has already seen this pattern, but simply saying Israel is now actively ethnically cleansing parts of Syria, ordering evacuation orders, settlers who gradually follow in. You're seeing a pattern. It's the same exact thing we're seeing. I mean, how long until we start human shields and tunnels and Hamas or Hezbollah, whatever group, the narrative to justify all these actions. It's pretty unnerving to see how this is what I was pointing to earlier for those listening. It's just that it's clear. It seems like everybody's acknowledging this. We recognize these are lies, and it just continues to stumble forward at the expense of human life. So before we get more into the groups in general, you mentioned two questions I want to get into in regard to the imminent collapse point, but any resistance from what you've seen, your research, because the argument was pretty interesting that this was, and we'll get into this around the deal point next and what the deal might have been, but very quickly saw basically no resistance. And that was pretty broadly reported from all sides of this conversation, that there was essentially no resistance. Now, it clearly benefited them to make it look like they ran and there's no resistance. So I'm sure there was some in there, but overall, it seems as if the conversation is that up until today, Israel's been bombing, as you highlighted, all of these Syrian installations and infrastructure with nobody fighting back. So two questions. Is that actually what's happening? And the same question therein, is there any resistance in that? And is that not illegal if there's no resistance?
No, absolutely. Of course it's illegal. I don't think there's anything that Israel is doing that isn't illegal, actually, since its existence. So, I mean, we shouldn't even perhaps be trying to figure out if it is legal or illegal. They are an illegal settler state at the end of the day. And so therefore, of course, they're going to be violating every single international law that exists. Not that I have any faith in international law anyway, because that's an entire captured, institutionalized complex anyway, that's corrupt as hell and is totally compromised and in service to the United States and their allies. Anyway, that was my little rant about that.
I agree.
And I've totally forgotten the question.
Oh, it's okay. Just the first one I first want to get at is, in your research over the last week or so, is there resistance happening? Are there people fighting back, or more importantly,
right,
is there a real resistance happening? And then the question is, does that then make the bombing of installations and military locations illegal if there's nobody fighting back?
No, of course there's no one fighting back. I mean, if you're talking about the situation now, look, Israel's excuse is that they're bombing all of these military bases and development centers and scientific research centers because heaven forbid the weapons fall into the hands of HTS and the terrorist groups. But hang on a minute. Isn't Israel already supplying weapons to those terrorist groups in order to take the territory of Syria on their behalf? Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
and
you know,
high
that
fiving at the border of the Golan Heights and continuing to support them on the ground, and it's,
yeah,
it's
exactly.
ridiculous.
And give them medical treatment and
Right.
provide weapons and funding and so on and support, because for them, I mean, multiple spokespeople of the Zionist regime have said on regular occasions that for them, ISIS is better than Assad. Anyway, anything is better than Assad. Let's face it, from the point of view of the Gulf states and Israel, Turkey, and so on, and the US, of course. So, of course, no, there's absolutely no resistance to this. In fact, Jolani, I think in one of his very first interviews, basically said, look, Syria is not going to engage in any other war. Today, they've told the Palestinian factions to stand down. Right. They're basically not going to provide any more weapons. And so all of this was sadly for nothing. October the 7th, now Khaled Mashal is back in control. And of course, we know that Mashal was in control when Hamas betrayed Syria in the early years of the regime change war, until Nasrallah made some effort to bring them back into the resistance fold from 2017 onwards. And in 2021, they came back to Damascus having been expelled because they were involved in the regime change operations against Syria. The leadership that was pro the resistance axis and pro Syria, like Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Daif, have been assassinated. Even Ismail Haniyeh, I would say he was a little marginal, but he did then come back into the resistance axis after 2017. So all of them have basically been killed. There are still a few left that would, let's say, still have some loyalty to the resistance axis and to Syria. But Mashal, no. And so, unfortunately, with Syria gone, I don't see now how.
Oh, hope I didn't lose you. It's early. We got a lot to get to. Shoot. Well, since there's an opening, so in case you guys missed the point I was making a moment ago. Oh, there we go. I got you back.
Strange.
I'll just finish what I was saying. Oh, that's an interesting view. I haven't seen that. That's all. Well, anyway, while she's regaining her video feed, the point I was making a second ago was ultimately the reality that, and in case you missed it, that it is illegal for them to be bombing these locations, regardless of the narrative they're laying out. Even if everything they've said was true, there's nobody fighting back. So these are just, I mean, that is literal terrorism. Right. I mean, that's what's really important to see. And they're making excuses for it. And compare that to anything that they've highlighted about what Russia's doing in Ukraine. It's quite hypocritical. So go ahead and pick up on your point there. You probably cut out maybe the last 15 seconds before that.
Oh, okay. Well, no, I mean, basically, I'm just saying that from an HTS perspective, they're going to do nothing to stop this. Mm-hmm. In fact, they opened the door to it. Basically, they gave the green light because there isn't going to be any resistance. And because the Syrian Arab Army has stood down and surrendered, then there's no one manning the air defense. So basically, Israel can be using the heavy duty bunker buster bombs that they couldn't use before because they couldn't actually violate Syrian airspace for the risk of being shot down. Now there's no risk. So, I mean, Israel is basically, I think they've bombed over 500 times now.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, no, there's no pretext for this. There's no justification for this. This is just state terrorism.
Which I know, people know why Vanessa responded the way she did a moment ago, because this is for the person that's just now becoming aware of this. It's pretty obvious to see Israel violating the law in 1,000 different ways, but it's important to see that, very clearly there. But pointed question on this: why wouldn't they just take these things? Like, I think it's probably because they don't have the resources, I guess. But why wouldn't they say, hi, Terrell Sham, go take control of these things? Is there more insight to that?
Well, I think there is an element of truth that they don't want all of this to fall into the hands of HTS, not that they're trained to use most of this equipment. because at the end of the day, it's a volatile proxy force that they've used. I mean, you know,
Right.
this is what they always do, right? Whether it's Libya or Afghanistan, it doesn't matter. They're volatile. And ultimately, of course, they're going to be fighting amongst themselves. But why wouldn't they also fight against Israel if they finally sort of realize, well, hang on, Israel's going to be grabbing more of Syria and we want to keep that bit of Syria, etc. So, no, I get it from a realpolitik perspective that Israel, in that sense, is correct that they don't want it to fall into HTS hands or any of the other factions that are on the ground and might try and take power in the future and so on. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's a really important point. Really, for a conversation another day, would get deeper into that point about you know, just because the proxy force exists does not mean that they have complete control over its actions. And I think Saudi Arabia has even made that point in the past. MBS himself, I think, kind of alluded to in an interview that clearly they were responsible. Their kind of Wahhabi mindset around a lot of these terrorist organizations, rather the ideology around it, and that ultimately they've lost control of some of these elements. So they are exactly what they funded them into being, and then they just went their own direction, you know? And so it's interesting to see how that works. And I think we've seen this with a lot, like even the Kurds with the US, how one day they're working with them, the next they could care less what happens. You know, it's just interesting. So that's important to think about right there, is that, so that can answer the question, that ultimately they just don't know how the future will go. So it's better for them to destroy everything. And then ultimately that allows a situation where nobody could fill that role in Syria, which is another sad reality that Syria is ultimately gone because of that.
Yeah, and exactly, that's the point, is that they're ensuring that in the future, regardless of who is in control in Syria, they don't have access to the weapons and to the ability to either attack Israel or to defend itself against Israel.
They've effectively turned it into another Gaza then, essentially.
Yeah, they've turned it into a playing field for the predators that are now going to sort of pick the country clean in one way or another. You know, you have Turkey in the north, you have Israel in the south, you have Israel and the United States up the southeast and northeastern corridor. You've got HTS through the rest of the country, basically. But at some point, of course, what's going to happen, as I've said, you've got a cauldron, therefore, in the center of the country, which at some point is going to turn against itself, because you know, it's not only Jolani, it's not only HTS, you've got multiple other groups and nationalities also. You've got foreign mercenaries fighting under the banner of HTS. But at what point are they going to, you know, start warring for control in certain areas for religious fanaticism, because they don't feel that it's, you know, Sharia enough for them or whatever. And we're already seeing this in the conversations again on social media, where some of the Chechens or some of the Uyghurs are saying, well, we don't accept this, you know, this isn't true Sharia, we want it to be more strict and so on. And of course, Jolani's under instructions to try and be as moderate as possible. And people do really need to remember that this guy is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and you know, is the commander of some of the most brutal terrorist forces that operated inside Syria, like Jaish al-Islam. And I noticed that Mohammed Aloush is in the supposed new inclusive government that is made up entirely of extremist Islamists. So hardly inclusive.
Yeah. I mean, I got to just say, I find it actually, I mean, I guess it fits with the rest of how absurd things are these days, but to even use the phrase diversity friendly jihadist, I'm just like, how are we just the Babylon Bee today? Like it just, well, you know, an interesting point on that note, actually, and if you want to laugh at this with me, that, you know, so the term intifada, for example, which just means resistance. You know, it's like using the word revolution. You can use that in all sorts of ways, but obviously we can say the American Revolution, it's a positive thing. And it's the same difference in the conversation anywhere else, but the word jihadist is a bit different. You know, it's very specific, and yet it's being used by people in the Republican conversation. Like it's somehow, now it's weird how one can become whatever you want it to be when there's opening. You get the point. It's just completely hypocritical and blind to the reality of it. And now literally, I guess I wonder whether that's part of this design. Like, why would they actually use those terms? It is comic. It's cartoonish.
Well, actually, the whole concept of Islamic extremism was, of course, originated by the Zionists.
Right. Yeah.
So all of this terminology has been effectively foisted upon us by the Zionist movement, by the various lobby groups and organizations that support the Zionist movement. This whole concept of extremist Islam, which I also, because I had this conversation earlier today, when someone was alluding to the fact that, well, you know, white Muslims always fight amongst themselves, and this is a big problem, and so on. And, you know, I said, okay, like, we have to look at this in a different light, because pre 2011, were Muslims fighting themselves in Syria? No. You know, Syria was one of the most secure and stable countries in the Middle East at that point. It was a fantastic country if you listen to people that were there,
Right.
Syrians that were living there before 2011. So what does the West do? The West creates organizations that have an extremist ideology. So either Wahhabis, Saudi Arabia, or the Muslim Brotherhood, supported by Qatar and Turkey. And those elements are weaponized to create this sectarian division and strife and violence in those countries. And then people have to actually fight back to be able to survive. And we're seeing it now because, you know, when you've got the BBC and CNN and dear old Clarissa Ward lying through her teeth again, and Jeremy Bowen running alongside crowds heading for an execution as if he's going to a Christmas party, you know, it's very difficult to understand what you're actually normalizing when you kind of accept this sort of reporting. You know, suddenly Sednaya becomes the new Holocaust. And this was debunked back in 2013, 2016. Amnesty International rolled back their report because it was all AI generated. People have forgotten all this. It's forgotten. It's just gone. You know, we already debunked all of these narratives, but now it's back as the new Holocaust, and everything's forgotten about Said Tayman in Israel, where they're actually sodomizing Palestinians that are not even charged with anything, or Saudi Arabia, or Egypt, or America, CIA black site. You know, all of that is forgotten. Everything is focused in on Sednaya and this sort of post-apocalypse Hitlerization of Assad. We're back on that again.
Right.
We're
Of course,
right back on that track again.
also ignoring the U.S. associated exact situation in northeastern Syria, northeastern Syria. And this is from a newer report from April 17th of this year, and I'm sure you're familiar, right? And it's as you can see right there in the line, it's with the support of the U.S. government, torture, injustice, and death. You know, and it's I mean, as you highlighted as well as the Rukban Al-Tamf area. You know, and it's just it's disgusting, and we'll come back to that in general. I want to get into the actual fake news part of it.
I mean, how many people are in jail in Idlib?
Right. Or in Israel in general, you know, like all these overlap. I mean, as you pointed out, the literal on video rape in a prison. And, you know, we're not highlighting that. It's just, we'll come back to that because I do want to ask you more questions about the prison itself, because that's important for people to hear. It's the information around that, as you've highlighted, has been debunked more than once, which is most of these stories. But let's go in next to, I'll let you actually pick which thing you think will be better to start with. Do you want to focus on the information around Hayat al-Sham and Idlib and that focus, or the deal conversation do you think it's more important to break down what these groups are first, or talk about the deal that might have happened in the last so many weeks?
Well, I mean, I think we can very quickly break down who these groups are. I mean, Jolani, as we talked about, he was incubated in the CIA black sites in Iraq. He was sent as the emissary of Baghdadi, sort of ISIS, basically, into Syria. He then formed Nusra Front al-Qaeda in Syria. He then went on to form various coalitions of terrorist groups inside Syria. And he pretty much had command, not over all of the groups in Idlib, but he had command over, let's say, the most dominant groups in Idlib. He provided surveillance operations for the United States so they could pick off the other groups that potentially could be a threat to Jolani's supremacy in Idlib. but under his control are also like thousands of foreign extremist factions, like even Kurdish Salafists, Chechens, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Uyghurs. I mean, I was looking at a map the other day from 2014 of where the terrorists were coming from inside Syria, and it was extraordinary. I mean, they're coming from everywhere, from Norway, from Finland, from all of the Balkans, from Kosovo, from America, from EU, from Australia. Like literally, they flooded in from all over the world, and they're still there. So when we talk about this being Syrian against Syrian, of course it isn't. At least 50% of those groups are foreign mercenaries, foreign ideologically driven, some of them, but mercenaries and proxies, right? So that's what I'm saying. At what point are they going to retain any kind of allegiance to Jolani and to HTS? Very unlikely, unless,
It's
of
sort of
course, the money is good.
right. Well, it's sort of like the Azov movement dynamic. I mean, it literally is the same proxy element. Because I mean, even it's pretty. I think it was Scott Ritter that covered this the most. But where when Zelensky first took power, he walked up to them and they basically laughed him off, like you're not in control, you know. And that was on video. I remember seeing the video myself. I played on the show. And so what's interesting is you got this proxy element. So in a way, even though Jelani clearly has some level of influence with his group, your argument is that ultimately it's just because of the chaos they've created, anybody else could ultimately start. I mean, like even the Kurds come into play, because I don't think the Kurds seem to be in line with the vision they have for what's coming next with what Golani or anybody else has. So eventually one of these things are going to come up against each other, like we saw in the last dynamic where you had the State Department and CIA forces fighting each other inside of Syria,
Well, the Kurds have done what they've done historically. They don't learn from history that whenever they're supported by whoever that power is, they're going to be betrayed. And of course, that's exactly what's happening right now, because they're being attacked in the northeast by the Turkish SNA forces. And they're literally begging America to stop it and to get Turkey to call off the troops. I mean, it's not going to happen, and people were telling them. I mean, they had the experience in Afrin when they rejected the Syrian Arab Army offers to come in and help them resist against the Turkish proxies coming in and occupying Afrin, and they refused, right? And so then what happened? The Turkish mercenaries came in and there was a massacre and they were fully displaced from Afrin.
Right.
So,
I mean,
I don't know. With the Kurds, it's very difficult to really have sympathy, because how they couldn't see what was coming, that at some point they would be left to the wolves because a deal would be done. And as it has been done between Turkey and Israel to conduct this attack in the first place, right? Because Turkey at the moment gets the north, and it gets from Aleppo across to the northeast. The Kurds are out of the picture.
Well, I honestly don't have much like I don't see them in the same category as I would any of the other groups we're discussing, but you're still I think, as you're pointing out, acknowledged, aware of being used by these elements. So it's like you said, I don't really have much compassion for what that, you should have learned from these mistakes thus far, I think. Like, I think they have the design on obviously their Kurdistan area, but as you're pointing out, that's not the designs anybody's laying out. But so this is a good segue into the question about whatever went down in the last, with the potential of whatever deal was brewing that I've heard you discuss. Because obviously right there, I would argue that looks like ultimately Turkey getting what it wanted out of this, and the Kurds, as usual, getting thrown at the bus by the U.S. government. But so was there a deal that took place with all of this? And I'd like to start from the point of where, like, when we were talking about this in the first and a little bit before, where it was sort of like, the sleeper cell elements, that ultimately it seemed as some kind of an agreement was made where Assad didn't really resist. We saw the point where even Sputnik reported that he had essentially resigned and would call for peaceful transition. So what really went down right there? And do you think that somebody was, what the deal was not honored by one of the parties?
I'm only theorizing, right? I don't have any, hard evidence, but just looking at the picture on the ground, I mean, I know for a fact that when the defense of Aleppo was first breached, I mean, there was something like 30,000 Syrian army forces defending Aleppo. And I know that in the east, the forces that were there were steadfast. They stayed. When they decided to stay, the Russian forces and the commander of the Russian forces left, and they went back to Khmeimim. Now, at the same time, Russia was still bombing the HTS supply lines. I think we talked about this. But they left them. They abandoned the Syrian army that didn't withdraw from the eastern side. And in fact, that particular brigade then went down to the south of Aleppo and liberated the people that had been trapped in the Al-Safira area to the south of Aleppo, which consisted of military cadets, civilians, evacuees from Nubal and Zara, the Shia towns to the northwest of Aleppo. Then was when this kind of strange collapse seemed to start at this point. Now, in defense of the Syrian army, because a lot of people are being very critical, there are videos circulating of a Russian Humvee driving past them, like swearing at them and calling them cowards and so on. But you know what? Like the Syrian army has been fighting for 14 years. They're paid on average between $30 to $50 a month. Every terrorist is on around 2,000, and that's without all of the profiteering and the taxes that they take from the civilians and the general kind of corruption and theft that goes on, particularly in Idlib or in any of the areas that they ever occupied, right? And Bab al-Hawa, which was the main humanitarian crossing, according to the UN, was a trading post for HTS. So they had money rolling in thanks to their backers in the EU and Turkey and the United States, etc. The Syrian army had been fighting for 14 years. From 2020, many of them had been decommissioned and then were brought back in, of course. There were a lot of rookie soldiers in there, young conscripts that had been brought in since 2020 and really had no battle experience at all. And when you've got that kind of scenario and you're faced with overwhelming forces that have been backed by NATO, weaponized by NATO, trained by NATO, have the equipment that has been given to them by NATO member states, either through Ukraine or through Turkey, right? You are facing overwhelming force. Plus, then they had the drone technology on top of that. And someone who was actually on the field in Hama told me that's what's killing us. Like they're just driving holes through our lines because we don't have the defenses to be able to deal with the number of drones that they're throwing at us. And so then, you know, we know the story. In Homs, there was a degree of resistance because Hezbollah came into Homs, because for them, Homs is important because that's the main part of their supply lines from Syria into Lebanon. And there were some Iranian forces still on the ground at that point and Syrian army. So to say that the whole army collapsed is a little bit unfair. I think there were elements that kept fighting. There was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of jamming of signals between the brigades and their commanders and so on. So instructions were not getting through. But ultimately, for me, a deal was made long before this happened, in my opinion. And I think we talked about the fact that for me, there was a very strong possibility that Trump was going to try and do a deal, sacrifice Assad, because by sacrificing Assad, he's keeping everyone happy, right? When I say everyone, I'm talking about the Gulf states that have normalized with Israel, whether officially or not, they have normalized with Israel. Turkey.
So when you say sacrificing Assad, you mean a deal with Russia?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, because it's the only one that makes sense to me. Because Iran, to a degree, you know, I think Iran had genuinely attempted to offer support to Assad. I was told by a number of contacts in Iran that they understood relatively quickly that there wasn't going to be a major stand. So for them, that meant that they will withdraw, because for them to increase their troop presence would not be correct. And that's why you saw them saying, we need a request from the Syrian government to come in, and then we'll come in. We're perfectly prepared to do that. And everyone here was like, okay, make the request, you know.
And I think
but it didn't come.
I saw reporting around that time that even right before we talked, that the Syrian government had actually asked, in some cases, the Iranian elements to move back and to leave the area. So right there, do you think that, like you said, so there's a deal that was before this? So that makes sense insofar up to the point where, why wouldn't then Assad have said something? Why wouldn't there be a different response? Because it does seem to be as if there was like unison in the original agreement to like not have much of a response. But so just kind of connect the dots for me right there. So does that mean that somebody screwed him over somehow and he didn't see it? How do you see that connecting?
Well, I mean, honestly, I do have to say I'm still working this one out, right?
I know, yeah. Your disclaimer, this is complete theorizing right now.
We don't have all the facts, but that again is my issue with people who react in a way that is in advance of really knowing exactly what has happened. There may be actions taken that they can't explain, but I'll explain what I mean by this, because I think today Reuters put out an article, and basically they were saying, Assad didn't warn anyone. Various members of his close government had asked him for advice and so on, and he didn't respond, or if he responded, he told them everything. And this doesn't make any sense to me.
I agree.
If I look at Assad, and the problem is now, of course, if you say anything in defense of Assad, we're just back in that area where, you're just an Assadist, like this kind of thing. But I'm looking at this logically. Like, how many weeks ago was he at the Arab League summit and shaming the Gulf states? Because everyone was also saying, well, the problem was that he pivoted towards the UAE and towards Saudi Arabia, and he saw the future of Syria with them, not with Iran and not with the resistance. That's another narrative that's being brought into the kind of melting pot. But then why did he shame them at the Arab League summit very recently about the genocide in Palestine? And he was the most, forceful speaker there about what was happening in Palestine, and that there needed to be unity and they needed to actually do something rather than just keep talking about it. And this, this is President Assad. This is how consistent he's been since he was president, really. We've never seen any deviation from him in his public speaking, from the causes that he supports, the alliances that he has, and so on. We've never seen him deviate from this. And we've never really seen Syria deviate from its alliance to Russia since 1946, and for which it's suffered endless CIA and MI6 campaigns to remove governments and coup d'etat and military interventions and so on that have been ongoing for 75 years, because their alliance with Russia was what they defended for that length of time. But I think this is part of, and I do have to say, I don't have any evidence to support this, but I'm just using my logic right now. Why would he act so out of character, having fought for 14 years to defend the country and to defend the people? Why would he ignore his closest advisors and his closest government members and leave them in a situation where they're at risk, fundamentally? Unless he is, part of the deal is that he's not allowed to do that. Now, why is he not allowed to do that? If I put myself in a kind of Mossad psychology area, that would be the best thing for them to make him do. Why? Because that increases the demoralization by 100 million thousand times, right? Which then completely ends any potential for counter resistance or any kind of resistance against what's happening. And friends of mine are saying, you know, the anger against him in the streets right now is something that they're shocked by it. But as I said, I'm just thinking out loud. I'm just
Right.
theorizing. I'm not saying that this is definitely what happened, but it's all too odd for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just trying to kind of think what might have happened.
Well, taking
And
it
I
one step.
do think, I do think the one who would make a deal would be Russia. Why? Because Trump is incoming, and we talked about this, that when Trump comes in, everyone thinks they can do a deal. And Trump has been laboring the fact that was his main campaign promise, that he would end the war in Ukraine. So even for Trump, there is a degree of importance for him to end the war in Ukraine, so that he looks as if he's maintaining his campaign promises.
Mm-hmm.
So what if there's a deal made between Russia and Trump that make huge concessions on Ukraine, but Russia gives them Assad,
Yeah.
and gives them Syria? And because, of course, it's not only to the US, it's to Turkey and Israel also.
Right. Well, so this is where the next, and again, it can express clearly all theoretical, that the logic around it. Then why then would Assad play into that? What does he gain from that situation? And so let me, if I could, let me float based on what you laid out for us last time and your ongoing work and a lot of others like Isabella, why am I blanking on her name all of a sudden? I always do that. I feel like I mix them up.
Isabel.
I just call her Fee all the time, so I forget. But so a lot of your guys, you're doing great work out there and trying to be objective and break this down. And so what I kind of, same thing, theoretically trying to piece this together, what made sense to me is that obviously, and I agree, what you've laid out over the years, and of course, it could be some long con, lie about what he really is, but he's been consistent about that. I don't believe he is the way that they framed him. I don't believe, I mean, again, with all the lies of chemical weapons or the prison that you've proved, why would they have to make these things up if he's the monster they make him out to be? Now, I come from a very, pessimist government perspective. I think any of them could end up being something that's a problem, but I would agree that I don't think he is that. So keeping that in mind, I would argue if his actions are being taken that make him look this way, it would be for something that would benefit the people of the country or in some way be the greater good of the situation. And so what makes sense to me here would be that ultimately there was some kind of a deal that was made. And as you know, this was going on before this point, where I think they were reporting that the Biden government, and for those out there, you guys already know this, I see the government of the U.S. making these deals, whether Trump or Biden. I think it's the same entity, but ultimately that the agreement was made before in the interest of having him stop work with Lebanon, right, with Hezbollah. And so ultimately the deal could have been for him to step back from this, potentially relieve himself from power, which is what Sputnik reported early in this, that he resigned, called for peaceful transition. So I don't know whether that's relevant or not, or true or not, but so ultimately that he resigned with the interest of making this again, I forgot to add that we remember that with Ukraine being added to this, Russia has been overextended in that regard, I think, when it comes to what's going on with Syria to a degree. So maybe they realize that we're in a position where we can't protect what's going to happen. So they make a deal to ultimately say, okay, I'll back away as long as there's a peaceful transition and Syrians can elect their president, right? And so I could see, as much as I don't think the U.S. would ever respect it, the U.S. government entering a deal like that. And then Israel with Turkey blow inside of Syria and start taking over all the territory. And then the U.S. which by the way, as you remember, the U.S. has been in that position countless times in the past, which I would argue they're just as capable of lying and going in the same direction. But where they do make a deal and Israel just goes, we don't care, we're going to take what we want, and then the U.S. has to defend that. I think that's happened more than once in the past. So what do you think the likelihood of that is? And that ultimately the U.S. is now hell-bent on trying to make themselves look like they aren't being played, as usual, by Israel, and trying to make it seem like this is what they wanted, or defending the terrorist group that's now in charge. And and then Assad is left kind of being screwed. I think what do you think of that? Is it logical?
Yeah, kind of. But I think you also need to remember what they were courting Assad to do until he cancelled the whole thing in 2009, which of course was the Qatari pipeline.
Right.
And where did the Qatari pipeline run through? It ran through Syria and Turkey. So it makes sense to me that the US would enable Turkey to get involved, for example, and Qatar is the other beneficiary, because ultimately that means they go back to and I think today there were a few headlines of Erdogan and Qatar talking about the reemergence of the pipeline project.
Surprise, surprise.
So, so I think for the US that's a major win for them. But I think also for Israel in particular, you know, of course it serves them. Syria will be plunged into chaos and never ending. It'll basically become another Libya.
Right.
But to a degree even worse, because not only will you have the warring factions and the kind of ethnic cleansing pogroms that are ongoing at the moment, people in Syria are terrified. And you know, you've got various factions that know that they're going to be a target gathering at the Syrian border to get out. Many of them don't have papers. It's horrendous. Christian churches have been desecrated, and you know, and they're desperately trying to maintain this veneer of respectability. But of course, like ultimately, what are they? They're terrorists,
Right.
you know, and they aren't going to just have an epiphany overnight and become good human beings. And that's another thing. Now they're talking about lifting the bounty on
Right.
Jolani, or whatever his name is now, Ahmed al-Sharaa,
Right.
and lifting the sanctions and preventing refugees from the minority sects inside Syria leaving and coming to Europe as refugees. I mean, that for me is just pure criminality, because
Yeah.
what they're saying is, no, we'll leave you there to die.
We'll trap you there
Right.
to
Or
die.
yeah, to be persecuted. It's horrendous. You know, when they're paying, many of the refugees who came were members of the extremist factions who escaped to Europe. Not all of them, but many of them. And they're paying them 1,000 euros or whatever the currency is to go back to Syria. Like, how does this work? You know, that just means, okay, we'll go back and reinforce the Islamist extremist factions that are now ruling Syria to ensure that you're even more powerful, and the minorities that are under threat can't come.
Well, an interesting point to make in that too, as well, is that this is the conversation usually from a U.S. perspective around the border conversation is about the military age males and what that is. And you know what's interesting is you can find that here's a good example of who's actually funding and arming and putting this into act, which would be the U.S. and Israel and Turkey, I would guess as well, in the context of the actual terrorist entities being within the refugee element. And ultimately, then what happens is the Syrian people, who are actually just innocent people in the situation, get the brunt of the problem, because it's the same cycle everywhere you look, you know. And in other cases, it ends up being, well, even like right now with like the border in the United States, or in general, the immigration conversation is it's the average people become the focal point as the enemy, when in reality, they're the ones being used by this kind of situation. I thought that was just relevant to point out. I wanted to ask you about the Assad speech, because you would put it out on Twitter in general that if anybody has information about why that might not have been put out, and you reference a source inside the Syrian government that had claimed that there was a speech that hadn't gone out. So I wanted your thoughts on that, kind of to put a pin in this part of the conversation, as you referenced about Assad and my point about why he wouldn't have said anything. I think the speech is a really important part of why, like, the demoralization to it, and you know, why people are angry with him now who might have otherwise supported him.
Yeah, and I think, you know, that's, as I said, a very typical tactic of the Zionists and even British intelligence agencies, this kind of mind manipulation game, you know, that they play. And that's why it just started to dawn on me, well, that would make sense, because then that would even alienate, that would reduce any of his credibility, basically, even with people that were close to him, which then would cascade down into normal society, right? Because effectively that would mean that he's putting his own people at risk, rather than, I suppose, the idea that was being put forward was that he was going to leave in order to prevent bloodshed.
Exactly.
And you're right, there was originally a deal that there would be a transitional government. He would remain for 6 months and then it would get handed over. Now, potentially, of course, there may have been a scenario where there would have been another Gaddafi, and it could be that whoever made the deal and was managing it said to him, no, like, you've just got to go, because the risk is too high. And you know, we don't know. I mean, that's the bottom line. At the moment, we're just speculating with the information that we have.
I can tell you one thing, though.
I
was going to say the story they're putting forward clearly is not the truth and not the answer to this. I think that's quite obvious.
No, and I think the speech thing, because, you know, I was told that by two people that I know to be sort of very trustworthy as regards information. And it kind of made sense to me that he would have prepared something like that.
Right.
Now, in the Reuters article, one of his top advisors, apparently, if this is to be believed, he called them to come and help him write the speech. But when they got there, he wasn't there. Right. So that's one aspect to it. You know, because that's the thing. There's so many different narratives going on and floating around now, and people are getting very emotionally invested in it and getting very angry, and therefore it becomes very difficult to sort of have a reasonable conversation with anyone about what has actually happened. But I think with the speech, and I was contacted by other people who said they'd seen it on Facebook and then it was immediately taken down. So people are kind of like, what is going on? You know,
Yeah.
did he make a speech? For me, again, it's still very difficult to believe that he didn't.
I
That
agree.
he didn't attempt to communicate with people, that he just disappeared. And I think at that point, pressure was put on him to do so for whatever reasons. I don't know, maybe to save his life, maybe to say, you know, reduce the risk to his family. It could be any manner of things. Like, you know, because I've been speaking to people that even for me disappeared off the radar. There were National Defense Forces leaders that just disappeared from me and have only just reappeared right now. But I don't know what happened to them between the time that it was decided they had to just get out, and most of them have left with nothing, like literally just the clothes on their back. So obviously there was an urgency involved, right?
Yeah.
And maybe as part of that deal, when they realized that the risk was too great, everything had to just end there and then and there.
Right.
But you know, it's as I said, I'm just trying to put stuff together.
It's like we lost you again. Well, I'll just add one point on it that hopefully we get you back here. That I think that's it just the only thing that sticks out to me as something that doesn't line up with this is that why they wouldn't be saying something now. Why wouldn't Putin or Assad or somebody in there, you know, or just those two in particular? Why would they have not to this point have said something about that? You know, even like I guess to answer my own question is that I think the point would be, again, completely hypothetical, theorizing, is that there must be some kind of factor that's holding that back, whether it's in their interest for some longer play, or that ultimately it's because there's some kind of factor that's being used against them, somebody that they're holding, or who knows? But that is the only way that makes sense to me. I just can't wrap my mind around why at this point, looks like we lost her, which comes back, that they would not have said something or made that clear by now. Because as if for those that are new to the conversation, it's been reported by Russian media, Russian sources, as predominantly, I think, Russian sources, that he fled to Moscow and is in Moscow safely. Is the narrative? But we have yet to see any video, any statements, and that's very strange. So it also could be possible that he's not alive anymore, and that would indicate, I guess, that Russia would be involved in some way. Again, it's all completely up in the air. But assuming if we don't get her back, I'm just going to go through a few. We had a few more things we were going to get into. I was going to go a lot longer than an hour today, but we might have just lost her. Remember that she is. Actually, I'm not even sure where she went to. Maybe she doesn't want us to know where she is now for safety reasons. Remember, she was in Syria and she got out right when this was all getting pretty hairy, and she is obviously safe now. But so I'll go through some other points then, and hopefully we get her back. What I will do actually, let me do this real quick. That works that way anyway. So what I'll highlight again and see if I'll just kind of wrap through these tabs. If she doesn't come back, we'll kind of finish up there. That I highly recommend you check out the interview we had on the 1st. Oh, there we go. We got her back now.
Sorry.
There you are. So all I really had said was that what I found interesting, the one anomaly to what we highlighted there, again, very clearly expressing that this is completely theoretical, is that why neither Putin nor Assad would have said anything at this point. Why they wouldn't have posted anything or shared anything. And all I simply added to answer my own question, hypothetically, is that it would make sense to me that would indicate that there's some factor that's stopping that. Whether this is in their interest to hold it back for some longer play, which I also did consider earlier, about whether this is, that there was a strategic defeat for the interest of the full resistance, which day by day seems less likely. I'll give you that. But I was considering that whether there was something larger that they thought maybe allowing Israel to overextend itself. Anyway, the point being that why they wouldn't have said anything now to this point, either that it was in their interest not to, or that maybe there's somebody that's being held, or, there's a factor that they can't for some reason, coercion, or I don't know. But that's the thing that stands out to me, is it doesn't make sense to me why they wouldn't have said something at this point, assuming he's safe in Moscow, which is also potentially not true as well.
Yeah. It was interesting in the Reuters article. They said that they reached out to President Assad in Moscow. I'm not quite sure how they managed to do that.
Yeah.
And the article was written, I think, by 3 people, which we commented on earlier was a little bit excessive. I mean, there wasn't an awful lot of actual information in there, but they were pushing this narrative that basically he'd betrayed all of his closest people,
Right.
and left them at great risk. I guess really we just have to watch the messaging from Russia and Iran and potentially from Assad, or maybe he won't. Maybe we're just not going to see him again. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like this is even here in Lebanon. There's conversations going on all over the place about what actually happened, because there's a lot of confusion, and that's the thing that was most noticeable. When the terrorist forces were drawing close to Damascus, nobody knew what was going on. I mean, even for myself, at one point I was told I should leave. The next minute I spoke to someone in Damascus, and they said, no, it's fine, the president is still here, I'm staying here, I'm not going, and so on. So I was like, oh, all right. Then someone else told me, well, there's a ceasefire coming in 8 hours, so we've just got to sit tight until whatever time it was in the morning. So I was like, because ultimately I didn't really want to leave, because I knew it was going to be, that would be it at that point.
Right.
And then suddenly it became, there's armed groups all around the house, and Israel started bunker buster bombing all the air defense around me. So I was like, okay, no, I don't think we're going to get back from this, really.
Yeah.
And then the decision was made to try and make it to the border as fast as possible. But that confusion was incredibly damaging for people, because there was just a vacuum of information. Nobody knew what was going on. Everyone was kind of hearing things here and there and making their own judgments, and those judgments were not very reliable. So whatever happened, it created a very difficult situation for the people in particular.
Yeah, I think that, again, if there was a deal made, things like that was clearly part of that. The silence, the confusion, the lack of information, clearly, and excuse me, the who benefits aspect is always an important question to ask. And I think that's very clear in this context, who is benefiting from what's ultimately happening. So again, theoretical, we can leave it there for now, since it's I'm sure we'll see as this goes forward. I wanted to get into a conversation about what comes next. And since we're just touching on this, in case you haven't seen how obvious this is, right now in Syria, there are, as I even literally titled the show this, where was it? Right here. As Israel further occupies Syria, Western-backed ISIS patch-wearing terrorists begin executions. That's how crazy this is, literally right in front of us as we speak. And I'll just, cut to the chase. You can see it for yourself. You got guys with ISIS patches openly executing people in the middle of Syria. You can see him right there with ISIS patch. I mean, and by the way, it's all, including that image itself. That's actually from, I checked it myself, that's from what's going on inside Syria right now. And so what's crazy is that not only do they have openly U.S., Israeli, Turkey-backed extremists who are executing people, the religious minorities in the streets, ultimately that this, and well, actually, before we go past that, we did talk about this in many previous discussions. I just grabbed one. This is from February 11th, 2020. Turkey and U.S. openly protect extremists in Idlib as lies begin to crumble. So, and we briefly touched it before, but just on Idlib itself, for those that don't know the relevance of that, so Hayat al-Sham, as I understand it, was basically, cultivated, if you will, percolated, whatever the right term would be, inside of Idlib. And that means that, so the U.S. and Turkey were provably existing in that area, right? So break that down for somebody who that wouldn't make sense for, like in Brett McGurk's comments and how that relates to where we are today.
Yeah, well, as Brett McGurk described it, what is it? Idlib is the biggest Al-Qaeda haven since 9/11. And various other comments were made, like Ambassador Jeffries, who was the Pompeo point man on Syria under Trump, also made it clear that, what did he say? Al-Qaeda is our asset inside Syria. And then going back to Jake Sullivan, the email to Hillary Clinton that Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. But yeah, the control, there weren't American bases, but as I said, there were 150 Turkish bases in the north and northwest of Syria, 28 American bases in the northeast and kind of central Syria around Manbij, and then the major base of Al Tanif on the triangle between Iraq and Jordan. And we know that weapons were flowing into HTS for years. When did the ceasefire come into effect? 2020, which was brokered between Russia and Turkey. And from then on in, those forces were being given the training and the weapons and so on to be able to lead the attack that they did.
And really quickly,
they were prepared.
At that point in time, these were being regarded as terrorists. Right. I mean, like, as you said, Brett McGurk saying the largest ISIS Al-Qaeda hotspot. And so at what point did that shift? Or, I mean, even at that point, they were still kind of playing it both ways, right? Where they were protecting it, but it was terrorists. So it's like I explain, how do they ever get away with this dual game they're playing even right now, where they're sort of supporting them, but yes, they're designated terrorists. I mean, we know they're hypocrites, but for someone this is new to, like, how does that line up?
Well, I think, again, it's this sort of double game, because the fact is that when they were being bussed out of the areas, taken out in the green buses from the areas that were being liberated by the Syrian Arab Army and their allies, they were still being described as rebels at that point, right? They only became Al-Qaeda when they landed in Idlib, right? And they weren't, it wasn't sort of a universal labeling of them as terrorists. No, they maintained the description of them as rebels. Or then it became when Jolani formed his kind of, what was it, salvation government, national salvation government in Idlib, and then suddenly they became political opposition. So to a large degree, the American establishment never really altered its view that, well, no, they're legitimate moderate rebels, like Timber Sycamore when Obama was funding 500 moderate rebels inside Syria, and lo and behold, all of the weapons and equipment was falling into the hands of ISIS. Surprise, surprise.
Not to mention that the moderate rebels themselves were terrorist extremists.
Working with ISIS anyway, right from the very beginning, and of course, all of these groups were incubated anyway. They were radicalized by the United States in the CIA black sites. And that's the whole point, because the US is weaponizing terrorism. Since the war on terror, terrorism globally has grown exponentially. So it's clearly not a war on terror. It's a war of terror against anyone that stands in the way of the US allied agenda in whichever region that they're focused on. Because, of course, these same terrorist factions are reappearing and are being rebranded in Africa and Yemen, in Libya. I mean, they're just being percolated around the globe wherever the US needs them. And when I'm talking about the US, I'm talking about the entire kind of alliance of US hegemony.
I remember you and I having a conversation in one of the many interviews of the past where we laughed at the changing of the name, I believe, to Hayat al-Sham. I forget if it was that one or one of the ones before it, but laughing about, oh, just got a name change, and the act, and the corporate media just treats it like something new. It's very transparent.
No, I mean, they just adopt it, and it's also it's a kind of way of confusing people. It's a way of distancing them from the truth, because most people are not going to pay attention to the minutiae. They're just going to go, oh, well, okay, now we're talking about some group called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, must be different, right? They're not necessarily, and when that name is used time and time again, and then they start to rebrand, and Jolani does interviews with PBS and CNN, then people kind of, and now people, I'm sure, are forgetting. I'm sure they're being destabilized in their belief, well, hang on, weren't these terrorists? And yet here they are, forming governments and the bounties getting lifted and the sanctions are getting lifted. But they must be the good guys. Maybe they've had a change of mind, you know?
I kind of think
such manipulation.
it really is. I kind of feel, I had a thought of this the other day that I get the sense that this is going to go a different direction where, I mean, it is very obvious, and maybe I question whether it's just obvious to us and other people are blinded by it, but I do think it's more obvious than usual. And that ultimately the game is to roll these people out, start by going, yeah, these are the rebels and they've saved Syria. But at the same time, they're going, but we're bombing ISIS, which, you know, that's even what's going on. And then eventually they just kind of merge together to where they just go, you know, the Hayat al-Sham becomes the villain of Syria, as then it rehashes the same game and we start all back over again. You know what I mean? Where as long as they've got the enemy they're fighting, I mean, historically, the U.S. ally of today is the villain of tomorrow. It goes as far back as you can look, you know? So I just mean like on a rapid scale, is that happening again, you know?
But I do wonder if that's why they're so desperate to vilify Assad, even in the eyes of, you know, his supporters within Syria itself, because I think also, you know, they have a purpose for HTS and ISIS and all the others. They still have Iraq to go. They have Iran potentially, so they still need them to a degree. So I'm not sure we're going to see that until we see the end of whatever or wherever this project is headed. Right?
Yeah, good point. Well, let's talk about the supposed, you know, transition government and the election discussion and all of that and get into, so just so it's clear that what we're talking about is the group we were just highlighting. These are U.S. Western-backed terrorists. Not mincing words, exactly what they are. And so now we're watching these elements just talk about democracy and elections and you know, diversity and all these. It's fascinating if it wasn't terrifying that it's actually happening. So I wanted your thoughts on this as we have, and first they talk about elections, right? So right out of the gate, this is democracy and freedom. And then right on the heel of that, they go, wait, 18 months transition period. And so I just think that's funny to point out that it very rapidly became, give us about a year and a half to continue the not democracy situation. But I simply pointed out that ultimately, you know, if they were to tomorrow decide, let's say they had an election and the Syrian people, assuming that was what happened, chose to pick Assad. Well, they wouldn't let that happen. So let's not pretend this is democracy, right? Like, it's obvious that that's not the reality. But what are your thoughts on the point of the government, the transition, the potential election? You know, is there any possibility this could translate into something Syrians want? You know, what are your thoughts on
it? No, like I mean, you know, it's kind of crazy. They've come to power through a coup. Initially, they were talking about it being a transitional government for the period of 6 months, which was when they were talking about Assad staying on in an advisory role until he handed over, etc., which I think was always going to be dreamscape. You know, that was just never going to be allowed to happen. And I've seen sort of messaging that they're putting out today, two different extremes. So first of all, they're saying, oh, you know, the poor Syrian people have been suffering without electricity and without fuel and without food. And
that? Sounds familiar.
Well, yeah, but without even mentioning the reasons for why they're suffering without fuel and food and electricity and
or ignoring
oil.
The genocide over here, the exact circumstances in Gaza, you know, it just ridiculous.
You know, so it's, and then at the same time, they're putting out all these various announcements every 5 minutes. And so now they're talking about they're going to go after journalists that, in their view, supported the Syrian government crimes. So suddenly, without any kind of, you know, judicial process, people are being executed, they're being hung, they're being hunted down, they're being massacred if they're from the wrong minority sect. They're being persecuted, and you know, journalists now who might have been patriotic during President Assad's presidency and who were against the terrorist forces backed by the West suddenly become traitors. I mean, this is a kind of a terrifying inversion of reality. Right.
Well,
it
not
really
only an inversion,
and nobody is going to stop it. That's the problem.
I was going to say, not only an inversion of reality, that it's, I mean, it's the obvious point is that you have this framing from the Western media and partisan element that this is somehow the Syrian people being saved, or at even like the very least that maybe it'll be worse, but this is what they got the bad guy out of the way, you know. And it's just right on the heels of this, it's exact opposite. Like, nothing they're framing is you know, they're hanging people in the streets, right? They're killing religious minorities right in the open. And so it kills me that they can even pretend to frame this as something other than, you know, what we've always been, at the very least, what they're telling you just got saved from. You know, I mean, it's the same old point. I'm just griping, I guess, at the fact that it's so frustrating that it continues to happen. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's fully supported by the mainstream media, of course,
Right.
you know. And the thing is that you know, the extraordinary thing is that yes, you've now got the BBC and CNN in there bolstering their image and making everything look normal. Executions are normal. This is what happens after, you know, after a so-called revolution. You get the executions, you get the guillotine, you get the gallows. You know, and I'm just thinking, if this were the other way around, if this were Russia doing this, for example, all hell would be let loose. But there's never, ever going to be any recrimination for these groups that are being backed by the West and are committing crimes and were committing crimes before. That's it. They're going to go scot-free until, of course, they become redundant to the US agenda, as you rightly mentioned. And then suddenly they'll become the target.
Well, that's the same point about Hayat al-Sham, right? I mean, you guys, there's a bounty on their heads. They've committed crimes. You guys have been telling us that for a decade, and now they just say different words. And so, what about the crimes they committed?
Now the bounty's coming off. You know, now they can lift the bounty because now they're an official government.
Right, but to your point, though, what about all the crimes they've committed thus far? Do they just vanish because they changed their name? You know, it's well taken. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And the journalist
I mean,
go ahead.
No, I was just going to also say, you know, how long before the Syrian people are kind of saying, even amongst themselves, oh God, I wish we had Assad back. Well, you know, because we hear this every time. Mubarak, Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi. Right. Sadly, most people regret that it happened and that they're gone, because the chaos and the terrorist vacuum that their country is flung into is far worse than anything that came before. And are they really going to fix the electricity? How? Is the US suddenly going to give them all the oil from the Northeast?
Yeah, maybe once Israel stops bombing all the infrastructure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's you know, the point is that they're destroying everything that would allow life to exist in Syria. So it's pretty obvious that they have no interest in keeping it safe for people, you know, but yeah, I think what it continues to show is, as everywhere else they're acting in the world, they're not doing what they claim they're doing. They're not here to save people. They're not here to fight for democracy. They're here at their own interest at the expense of literally everybody else around us. And I think that's why we continue to see these you know, stenographers of the West continue to lie. I mean, let's go ahead and finish on this point about the propaganda, because it is absolutely ridiculous, the level of what we're seeing. And I'm sure you've covered this already. And I think everyone's already, even just over the last couple of days, it seems like this has already been thoroughly broken down, completely exposed as utter nonsense in more than one example. And this is the guy that, you know, they're literally claiming came stumbling, you know, apparently, I mean, I'll read exactly what Arnaud wrote. He said, this really, really hard to believe. The Air Force Intelligence Headquarters, where this is taking place, has been freed since the 7th of December. So 4 to 5 days ago. So we're asked to believe that the CNN journalist visited a secret prison in that's been cleared presumably for up to 5 days and found someone left behind. And his main point first is that, you know, I'm pretty sure people can't survive for 4 to 5 days without water. And, you know, and are 1,000 other examples that even Twitter caught. You know, he seems to be well fed. He doesn't seem to be on dirty. So, you know, on that one alone.
Oh, no, but this one, if this was the Lebanese, he'd come there for hospital treatment.
Oh, well, there's this one here too.
That's another one, right?
Yeah. This one apparently was supposed to be kind of similar, where they go, oh, you know, there's another person that was kept, and the person comes in behind and proves that that's not the case. Like, it's crazy.
And I think there was another one where they had the kid talking. And he said, yes, I've been kept in the prison for 14 years since I was born. And the guy says to him, so how old are you now? He says, 10. It's like, what?
It's unbelievable. And to be objective, that doesn't have to mean that these things aren't happening, but it's incredible. And I think your evidence has clearly shown that they're lying about all of this, but that my point is always, if they have to manufacture all of these lies to sell this narrative,
exactly,
you should at least ask whether that's not really the picture, you know? Well, here's another one as well. This one was BBC put out. Man found wandering near Damascus after months in Syrian prison. And Craig Murray came out and said the evidence that Travis Timmerman was detained at all seems distinctly dubious. At the most basic level, for a white man who has been locked inside for 7 months, in all photos, he's entirely the wrong color. Same as most of these people. No prisoner pallor, flabbiness, huge amount of BS coming out of the media right now. It really is incredible. And then I'll just point out, as we did a second ago, that they don't seem to care at all about the very, very well documented evidence of what is actually continuing to happen in U.S. controlled areas in Syria or many other places in general. So if you've seen it, I'm sorry, I'm not actually showing it. That was just the one we mentioned earlier about Amnesty International.
Yeah.
But any other examples you've seen of just like egregious misinformation swinging around? Because it seems to be pretty common right now.
Well, no, I mean, it's just the fact that they're absolutely totally on board with HTS. I mean, they're not even bothering to try and hide it, and when they're accusing us of lack of objectivity or of bias, and we see them literally kind of salivating over an HTS power grab in Syria. It's horrendous. I mean, I actually sent Jeremy Bowen's report when he's following the crowds to a potential execution, and he's relishing it. And I sent it to a kind of a very professional journalist friend of mine, and they said, this is disgusting.
Yeah.
This should be condemned. Even in court, this is just appalling. This isn't journalism. And this is one of the so-called senior journalists at the BBC, because I query if they're journalists or intelligence assets, quite frankly, when they, the higher level journalists within state medias in the West and so on. I mean, we know that through CNN, and I'm sure Clarissa Ward, what's her name, Arwa Damon, I'm surprised she's not there, although I think she's kind of, since she sniffed the chemicals
busy
on the rucksack in Idlib, I think her kind of, usefulness went down a little bit, but still.
Alan McLeod, I think it was Alan McLeod from Mint Press News. I believe it was him, but I don't want to miss. Anyway, I think it was Mint Press News for sure. But they put out a great report about Mossad elements finding themselves into positions of influence in corporate media in the West, or specifically the United States.
It was definitely Mint Press News.
Yeah,
I think
Alan McLeod, I thought, but I think the point is that it's very obvious this happens. Let's 2 points that I want to end with in general. Your comments on this. There's the idea that there are Turkish citizens that turn out to be working for the IDF. This report from Al Jazeera, which, by the way, I will also argue, especially with this conversation, Al Jazeera is not somebody who we should be taking at face value, but never we should with any media for that matter. But the idea of the overlap of Israel in this conversation when it comes to Turkey, we mentioned this last time, right? The kind of feigned resistance back and forth between Turkey and Israel, and now being reported at the very least that there's IDF members with Turkish nationality that are acting within Turkey, which adds more to the possibility of the deal point you mentioned before. I just thought that was an interesting point. Thoughts on that to end, as well as where this may go with Iran, because you already have Netanyahu, like right now, as this hasn't even finished, already going Iran. Like we know that's where this seems to be going. Aaron pointing out how they're already commenting how we can bomb Iran better from this location. So just to kind of wrap up on that.
Yeah, and I mean, we know that Trump's administration is very anti-Iran. We've had Vance right from the beginning saying, we've got to hit Iran harder than before, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, no, I think, where are we heading? We're definitely heading towards potential of war with Iran, for sure. And for sure, Iran is preparing for that. As I said, I think next will be Iraq. They will try and create a corridor through Iraq towards Erbil and towards the border with Iran to prepare for any escalation against Iran. And then, of course, if they can do that, if they're closer to Iran right now from a launch pad in Damascus or from anywhere in Syria, really, because pretty much all of Syria is now related to Israel to one degree or another. Turkey, I guess, might at some point be some kind of thorn in the side of Israel, but I don't know. That remains to be seen. Turkey also, of course, is eyeing up the pipeline that we talked about. And yeah, I think we're heading for escalation in Iraq and then potentially Iran.
No, I certainly hope not. But sadly, that does seem to be where this is heading. And, and I worry about, I mean, I think right now what we can see is that this is carrying out a long-term agenda, right? And I think the obvious point is that Israel is, or rather the United States or the West in general, seems to be carrying out Israel's wars. I mean, I think that's not a hyperbolic statement. And I think that's been going on for quite a long time. And Iran is clearly the last one on, well, I mean, whether we don't want to talk about the 7 countries, 5 years, whether that's legitimate or part of something else, the point is that we can see Israel's been aiming at Iran for a very long time. And with Trump's incoming administration seeming to pull back any resistance on that at all, I'm very worried about where that goes. But, I guess what we have to, the point of what we're doing this for is I'm of the mind, as we touched on to begin, that there is this shifting of awareness around a lot of this stuff. And I think we have long since passed whatever might need to be passed to argue the majority is aware of this, right? And I think that's kind of clear. So what we need to do to get that to mobilize into some kind of action that drives action, that stops what's coming, that causes them to care that we see what they're doing. And I don't really know what that looks like, but I think it's important that we continue to highlight work like yours and continue to highlight the objective, nonpartisan information that's coming out, because I think it's growing. And again, as I've said before, I think this is kind of rapidly being reduced into a position where that just won't matter anymore. And I think this is part of it. I really do. I think this kind of dovetails with the globalism idea, even technocracy. I see this all interconnected. So on the way out in general, if you have any, hopefully positive notes for us, like any thoughts on what I just mentioned, just kind of leave us with something to what your thoughts are and where this goes and anything else.
Yeah, I mean, what I have been seeing is they haven't really changed their MO. When I was talking about the cancellation of Christmas for many Christians in Syria, I was immediately under attack that I was lying. And it was, what was interesting with a number of people that were coming up with headlines from a few years ago about how churches in Idlib, for example, were desecrated and so on, that Christmas was cancelled in Idlib under Jolani, so why would it be?
Right.
So it's interesting that I'm not necessarily needing to defend what I'm saying. And he tried to post something about one of the Christian towns that I'm probably closest to in Syria, Al-Skalbia, and they had just sent me a load of videos showing the desecration of one of the churches there. So while he was kind of trying to say, no, everything's fine, we've been speaking to the priests and we've agreed they can put up their, whatever it is, 53-foot Christmas tree, etc., trying to make themselves look inclusive and
right.
moderate. And then I'm getting sent at the same time video showing the damage to one of the churches in Skalbia, and the fact that many people from there have actually fled. People now at the moment are trying to deal with the situation they have, and of course that is being exploited, because when you've got videos like this, are they content to be having to take instructions from terrorist groups that 4 years ago, 5 years ago, were besieging their town and murdering their children with mortars on a daily basis? No, of course they're not, but they're afraid.
Well, and this is a good point to make in general, that, so here you're highlighting something that is historically clear. I mean, Netanyahu and Israel bomb every Christmas, as far as I can remember, Syria. It's a very common thing. But so they come in and call you a liar for pointing out that this is happening. And this is a good point to make, where here, yes, you can show them saying words. Yes, that sounds good. Yes, we'll do this. But here's your actual evidence as a journalist doing, well, here they are destroying the church that we're talking about. And so this is a good kind of ending and an analogy, I guess, of the reality. People can say a lot of things. Politicians, terrorists in Syria, and the people that want to support, that gain from it, will lie and say whatever they want. The point here is for you to do your due diligence, show discernment. Don't fall into whatever narrative works for your partisan side. Look to people like Vanessa, who are actually doing the work and showing you not what they're saying they're going to do, but what they're doing. I mean, it's amazing that we even have to make that point. But I think the Twitter files element of all this today, which, I use that point often, but I think people understand what I'm getting at, that instead of source material, it became screenshots of source material, and it's this slow decline. And so, again, I just really value your work and all of this, and how people will continue to go to your website, which I'll include down below, and all the work you're doing. It's just, I'm glad for you out there and people like you, Vanessa. So thank you for joining me again.
No, thanks for having me on, Ryan. Always.
And as always, everybody out there, question everything, come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
It starts, and it's really fascinating to go back. It starts in 1996 with Netanyahu, who wrote a book called Fighting Terrorism. And the thesis of the book is quite straightforward and very dangerous. He says, there's Hamas, there's Hezbollah, they oppose Israel. It's not good for us to fight them directly. That won't work. What we need to do is topple the governments that back them. So what we need is regime change throughout the Middle East. And he actually gave a long list of 7 countries that included Syria, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, Sudan, and Lebanon. And systematically, the United States has done Netanyahu's bidding for almost 30 years now, going to war with every one of them, except for the big one that Netanyahu so much longs for, which is the war directly between the United States and Iran.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who had used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran."